So our topic is, why does God care who I sleep with? And I want to begin by saying this is a compelling question. It's a question I've returned to often. I gave the book that title because it's a question I keep hearing. It doesn't matter where I'm speaking, what the context is. Almost always the sort of first question that comes back to me from my friends, from different audiences, is some version of why does this matter? And it's a compelling question because you would think there is no shortage of awful things in the world around us for God to be caring about. There's issues of justice, there's issues of war, there's issues of poverty, there's issues with the planet, there's issues of abuse, and you would think if God does exist, if he really is there, surely he's got bigger things to think about than what consenting adults might do in their bedrooms. So it is a compelling question. Not just for our friends who might not call themselves Christians, but for those of us who are Christians too. We find ourselves asking this question. But it's not just a kind of a relevant question, it's a really personal question as well, because as we think about the whole issue of sexuality, every single one of us has a story. All of us are sexual beings. God has designed us to be sexual beings. We have sexual energy within us. This was his idea. We didn't discover this behind his back. And what that has been like for each one of us will vary enormously from person to person. But all of us have a story to tell. Which means that for so many of us, this is really sensitive ground. We all have a story, and for many of us, the story may be a painful one. There may be hurt, there may be vulnerability. Some of us may feel damaged in this part of life. Some of us may be conscious of how we have been damaging to others in this whole area. Well, like many people in this city, and I'm sure a significant number of us today, my story is one where the only real romantic and sexual feelings I've experienced have been towards other guys. It took me a long time to recognize that. I was a teenager in the 90s, which was a long time ago. And these conversations weren't really happening openly at that time. I remember when I was about 14 or 15, my best friend at the time started dating a girl for the first time. And I remember it was a Monday morning, we were all kind of catching up on each other's news from the weekend, what we'd all been up to, and he said, I've just started dating this girl. And all the other guys in the group were kind of excited, enthusing, congratulating him. We're English, so we did that in a very, understated way, as you would imagine, just sort of, well done. That's about as excited as we get. But people were, in a British way, excited for him. But I felt crushed. And I didn't know why. I'd never consciously had any romantic sexual feelings for this friend, but the thought of him now being deeply intimate with somebody else left me feeling very vulnerable. And looking back, I was already beginning to have some kind of emotional attachment to him. And over the next years, I began to realize I was, developing in a way that was different to most of my friends. I was at a high school that was just for boys. There are a few of those still in the UK, which meant the only two things we ever talked about were sport and girls. When it comes to sport, I'm not much good. If you paid me to throw a ball, I would struggle to. I was just given a Lakers T-shirt for visiting California. I didn't know what Lakers was, but it's something to do with sport, apparently. It's something with a ball and a stick or something. I don't know what it is, but if it's possible, I think my center of gravity is actually outside of my body, because anytime I try and do anything like that, it just doesn't work. So I wasn't very good at talking about sport, and it turns out I wasn't that good about talking about women either. And so when the conversation would kind of come around the friendship group of who do you like? Who are you pursuing? Everybody had an answer to that question except me. And so when it came to me, I would try to change the subject. Hey, did you see Star Trek last night? Didn't normally work. And there were times, frankly, I would just lie. And so when the question was like, Sam, who do you like? Who are you pursuing right now? I would just sort of think to myself, quick, think of a girl's name. Just think of a girl's name and say it out loud. That's all you have to do. Denise. Denise. I like Denise. Which wouldn't really let me off the hook because the next question would then be, oh, do we know her? And I'd have to say, yeah, no, I don't think you will have met her. She's not from round here. She's from Norway, actually, so no, I don't think you will have met her or even know that she exists. Never occurred to anyone that Denise is not a traditional Scandinavian girl's name, but there we go. It was a painful time. I wanted to be like everybody else, but I wasn't experiencing the same romantic feelings that my friends were. And I remember when I was 17, I was on my way back home from school. I was just waiting for the bus to come along. And as I stood there on the roadside, I remember thinking to myself, I think I'm gay. That thought just hadn't occurred to me up until that point. But as soon as that thought assembled itself in my head, I immediately thought, well, yeah, that's obviously what's going on here. I don't have romantic sexual feelings for girls, and I am feeling some of those feelings for one or two of my friends. And at the time, I was beginning to apply for different universities, all of which were in different cities. I remember thinking, okay, well, when I go to university, maybe then I can run with this and explore this. In those days, I knew that the universities I was applying to had what were then LGB societies. So I remember thinking, okay, that could be where I begin to kind of explore my sexual feelings and just sort of see how it goes, and no one back home would ever need to know. But in between standing at that bus stop and going to university, something else happened, which I wasn't intending, I wasn't planning on, but I became a Christian. A Christian friend of mine had invited me to his church's youth ministry. He had invited me right at the end of the academic year when we'd all finished our last exams, and I had nothing else to do for several weeks. So when he said, hey, why don't you come along to our church, come along to our youth group, I couldn't think of an excuse not to quick enough, so I said, okay, I'll come along. And the first time I went, I heard the message of Jesus Christ. And I began to realize that Christianity isn't about God congratulating good people. It's about God coming to find lost people. And something within me recognized that I was lost, not necessarily because of my sexuality. I wasn't thinking in those terms. But I just realized that if God was there, if God had made me, I didn't know who he was. And so by definition, if God existed, I was lost. He was a stranger to me. And so I began to learn about what it meant for Jesus Christ to come and to find the lost. And very quickly realized I wanted to follow him. I wanted to become a Christian. And as I did so, then one of the big questions on my mind was, well, what does that mean for my sexuality? Does it have any impact on it? I had no idea. I didn't know whether Jesus spoke about these things or not. I knew I wanted to follow him. And so one of the first things I started to do was to look and to see what Jesus has to say about sexuality. And for many people today, it might be a surprise to think that Jesus said anything about this at all. It's very common for people today to think, well, Jesus was silent on these issues. He has strong things to say about justice. He has strong things to say about the poor. He doesn't have much to say about sexuality. But the fact is, he does. Doesn't talk about it in many places, but when he does, he has very significant things to say. And I want us to spend just a bit of time today thinking about one of the places where Jesus talks about sexuality, because it's one of the most foundational things he has to say on it. And what I want us to see is that there is no one who is more challenging when it comes to human sexuality than Jesus. But there's also no one who is more dignifying when it comes to this issue than Jesus. And there's no one who's actually more satisfying when it comes to this. So those are the three things I want us to think through. That the text I want us to look at is Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. It's just two verses, but it's kind of a super concentrated amount of insight that Jesus gives us in these verses. Let me read them to you. Matthew 5, verse 27, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." This, if you know Matthew's gospel at all, you may know this is part of a section of teaching called the Sermon on the Mount. And in this part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is taking some of the 10 commandments from the Old Testament, and he's kind of showing his listeners what those commandments really mean. So he's taking the commandments and saying, listen, this is what you've heard, but this is what it's actually about. He's not taking issue with the commandments themselves. He's taking issue with how these commandments have been understood. And he does that with this commandment in the Old Testament against adultery. So Jesus says in verse 27, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" And Jesus' listeners, they would have been most likely a group of Jewish men. They would be thinking, yeah, we have heard that. We know that commandment. We've heard that many times. We know it well. We should not commit adultery. The Old Testament had always said that sex was designed for marriage between a man and a woman, that any sexual behavior outside of that context was forbidden. Not an easy teaching. It's a teaching we can find difficult at times. But it would have been very familiar to the people Jesus was talking about. They knew that adultery was prohibited. You're not supposed to have sex where one of you is married to somebody else. So they knew this commandment. They were steeped in this stuff. And I'm sure many of those guys would have been thinking, yeah, and not only do I know that commandment, Jesus, I've kept it. A lot of those guys would have been thinking, I've never been unfaithful to my spouse. I've never messed around with someone else's. So yeah, Jesus, I know that command, and yeah, I feel pretty good about it. Okay, you got me with one or two of the other ones, fair play. But on this one, I'm feeling pretty confident. Well, Jesus says you've heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you, and I wonder if just for a moment whether Jesus' listeners were thinking, where's Jesus going with this? Yeah, we had the commandment, don't commit adultery. Jesus is now saying, but, and maybe they were thinking, maybe Jesus is going to loosen this up a bit. You've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery, but I say to you, you've got to follow your heart. That's probably how we would complete Jesus' sentence today. You've got to be true to yourself. We would say love is love in our culture. But listen to how Jesus completes that sentence. He says, I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman, and he's talking to a group of men, it could be either way around, everyone who looks with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So this is what I mean. Jesus is challenging. He's challenging. Jesus is saying, hey, this commandment was never just about external behavior. It was about your attitude. It's about how you regard other people. He's saying adultery doesn't just take place in a bedroom. It takes place in our hearts. It's not just, if I can put it this way, it's not just about what you do with your genitals. It's about what you do with your eyes, how you look at someone. It's about what you do with your mind, how you think about someone. And Jesus says if we look at anyone lustfully, we are breaking God's commandment. We are contradicting God's design for our sexuality. Because what we're doing as we look at someone lustfully is we're turning that person's sexuality into a commodity. We're turning that person's sexuality into something that is there for us to consume, whether physically or just mentally. And Jesus says that is actually misusing sexuality. It's not just breaching some arbitrary command from years ago. Jesus is saying, actually, it goes against the grain of how this is meant to work in us. That we tend to think today as Westerners that sex is about self-expression. It's how we express who we believe ourselves to be. And we would say to people today, you can't really be yourself unless you are giving expression to your sexual desires. That's your identity. It's how you express who you are. But in the Bible, sex isn't about self-expression. It's about self-giving. We see from many parts of the Bible that sex is meant to be a way of fusing a husband and a wife together at the deepest level of mutual self-giving. Tim Keller, the Christian pastor and writer, has said that in the Bible, sex is a way of saying to someone, I am giving myself to you fully, exclusively, and permanently. Fully because it's meant to involve the entirety of your person. You're giving them all that you are. Exclusively because if you're giving yourself to someone that way, you mustn't be giving yourself to other people that way. And permanently because that form of self-giving is designed to form a bond that is not meant to be undone and can't be undone without pain. There was a movie about, 15 years ago, a Tom Cruise movie called Vanilla Sky. It's a weird one, so if you haven't seen it, not one of his best. But there's a moment in that movie where Tom Cruise's character has a one-night stand with Cameron Diaz's character. And at some point later on in the movie, she catches up with him and challenges him on it. And she says to him, listen, when you sleep with someone, your body makes promises even if you don't. Not a great movie, but it's a great line. When you sleep with someone, your body makes promises even if you don't. That's the way sex is designed to work. And that's what this commandment is getting at. And that's why it's so challenging, because it's about our heart attitude. It's not just about our conduct. And Jesus' wider point here is that this was always the purpose of those commandments. The purpose of the Ten Commandments wasn't to give everyone an opportunity to prove how good we are. The real purpose of those Ten Commandments was to show up the natural incapacity in our hearts to follow God's ways. The purpose of those Ten Commandments were meant to be that for people to realize that we were always going to need God's grace and forgiveness if we were going to be His people. That was always going to be the dynamic between us and God, that we would need His forgiveness. Not that we would impress Him with our obedience, but that He would be gracious to us in our disobedience. And that's what Jesus is showing us here. Now, I'm English, and so I really shouldn't talk to Americans about dentistry. But back home in the UK, every year I have my annual checkup at the dentist. We do actually have dentists in the UK. There are 4 or 5 that I've heard of in the whole country. But every time I have my annual checkup, it's always a morning appointment, and that morning I always think, dentist today, I'm going to brush my teeth really well, like it's an Olympic event that morning. I'm going to be, their favorite patient, whatever it is. So I will, I'll brush my teeth. I will burn many calories brushing my teeth that morning. Blood will be pouring out of my mouth by the time I finish, right? And then I'll get to the dentist, and he'll do the usual thing where this is what I think being a dentist is. You get a paper clip and you untangle it, and poke someone's gums with it. That is being a dentist. So if you want to be a dentist, just do that for a bit. And then at some point, they give you a cup of pink liquid or something, and you take a sip of it, you kind of rinse your mouth out in it, and you spit it out. And the dye in the liquid is meant to show up the dirt on your teeth. And so the dentist would give me a little cup of this stuff and say, swill this out, I'm just going to see how clean your teeth are. And I'm going to be thinking, these teeth are going to be clean, sunshine. So I would take a sip of this thing, I would rinse my mouth in it, gargle it around, spit it out. He would then make me look in a mirror and show me my teeth, and they would be bright pink. And he would say, your teeth are never as clean as you think they are. And here's the proof. And Jesus is saying that is exactly what the Ten Commandments are meant to be doing with our hearts. We're never as good as we think we are, and these commandments show up the dirt that is in our hearts, the mess that is in our hearts. Because by saying to us, you know, if you look at someone with lustful intent, you've committed adultery in your heart, Jesus is saying, this is what your heart is like. This is what's down there. This is what you do. Our hearts are adulterous. We misuse our sexuality. We misuse other people's. And so the message of Jesus, and please hear this so clearly, the message of Jesus was never, hey, you guys are pure, and you must never mess that up. Otherwise, you've messed it up for good, and you'll forever be damaged goods. No, Jesus' message was always, you have a messed up heart. You never were that pure. And you need God's mercy. Everyone does. We're all broken in this part of life. We're all messed up in this part of life. We're all in the same boat. And so there's no place for looking down on somebody else because of their particular sexual sin. There's no place for demeaning anybody else. If there's one kind of sexual sinner that Jesus isn't good news for, he's not good news for any of us. Because none of us is what we're meant to be in this part of life. Jesus is challenging all of us to recognize what our hearts are really like. But amazingly, Jesus doesn't just come to this world to challenge us. Because Jesus is also, if we look at his words carefully, he is also dignifying us. It's the second thing I want us to see. Jesus has talked about the person doing the looking. He's told us what he thinks about that. But notice what Jesus is implying about the person being looked at. When Jesus says that if you look at someone else with lustful intent, you're breaking God's command, Jesus is saying, hey, that person has a sexual dignity that matters so much to God that it shouldn't be messed around with, even in the privacy of your mind. Jesus cares about how we think about other people. Jesus cares about how other people think about you. He cares about how other people look at you. He cares if someone is turning your sexuality into a commodity. He cares if someone is just reducing you into someone who exists to satisfy their desires. Jesus cares about that. It's easy to think, and many Christians have given this impression over the years, that, you know, the Bible is kind of down on sexuality. But if Jesus puts guardrails around human sexuality, it isn't because he has a low view of sexuality, it's because he has a high view of it. A friend of mine once said that, you know, Jesus on sexuality, it's a bit like how we think about cars. If you've got a really old car that's already dented and messed up and should have died on you years ago and somehow it's still running, you don't really care how you treat it. You don't really care who gets to drive it. You don't really care what anyone does with it. But you get a nice car, you get an expensive car, you're going to care how it's driven. And Jesus is showing us that our sexuality really does matter. It isn't just a matter of biology. We sometimes say to ourselves, oh, it's just physical. It doesn't mean anything. It's just the exchange of bodily fluids. Why make such a fuss about it? But we know that's not the case. We know it matters more than that. The Me Too movement has shown us that's not the case. We've become more conscious of the damage that is done by sexual abuse. And we see that that damage is not merely physical. It affects far more than the body, because sex is designed to be about far more than the body. And so it matters what we do with our sexuality. And it matters what is done to our sexuality by others. Jesus is dignifying to all of us. But finally, Jesus is not just challenging and dignifying. He is also, and this may sound a surprise to hear, he's satisfying on this issue. Let me try and show you why. If there's a sense in which we sometimes in our culture have too low a view of sex, we say, oh, it's just physical, it doesn't mean anything. There's also a sense in which we have too high a view of sex, where we think it means everything. And it's easy for people to think today, well, if you're not sexually fulfilled, you can't be complete as a human being. You can't be whole. You can't really be you. And there's a reason why we think that. There's a reason why it is instinctive for us to think, actually, this is quite significant. I'm told, I don't know these things, obviously, but I'm told that our English word for sex comes from a Latin word, sicari, which means to cut off, to separate, to amputate. In other words, the very business of sex, the very concept of sex, is something that speaks to us feeling incomplete and cut off. And there's a sneaking suspicion with all of us that actually maybe sex is the way I'm not going to feel that way anymore. So one writer puts it this way. He says, we wake up in the world and in every cell of our being we ache, consciously and unconsciously sensing that we are incomplete, we're unwhole, we're lonely, we're cut off, a little piece of something that was once part of a whole. We feel disconnected. But part of what Jesus comes into this world to show us is that our ultimate disconnection, our ultimate yearning, isn't sexual, it's spiritual. That's where the issue really lies. And so it's common for people to say, well, you know, your desire for spirituality, your desire for religion, your desire for God is really a desire for sex. Jesus says it's the other way around. Your desire for sexual completion actually is a sign that you're looking for God. One of the things Jesus shows us in his teaching is that our desire for sexual completion is actually a picture of a deeper longing that's within us. It's a picture of a deeper union that we're made for. It's a picture even of a greater consummation that is available to us. And it's not going to be found in sexual fulfillment. It's going to be found in knowing our Creator. Because one of the things Jesus called himself when he walked on this earth, he didn't just call himself the Redeemer or the Christ or the Messiah or the Son of God. He called himself the Bridegroom. Jesus is claiming that God has always been a husband. Jesus is claiming that we have always meant to be in a relationship with our Creator that is a bit like a marriage relationship. And so by turning up on this planet and announcing himself as the bridegroom, Jesus is showing us that he is the one who can give us that ultimate fulfillment, that ultimate satisfaction. He is the one that even the greatest human romantic and sexual experiences are ultimately pointing to. He is the one who's come to fulfill our deepest longings, and he does so by dying for us. If the Latin word for sex means to be cut off and amputated and all the rest of it, then actually we see as Jesus dies for us on a cross, he is cut off. He is made incomplete. He is made unwhole so that we could be made full, so that we could be put together, so that we could be filled up, so that we could be made complete. That is what we find as we come to him. That is the experience he is inviting us into. Now, following Jesus is not always easy. Actually, Jesus is the one who says that. He's upfront about that. Following Jesus in this area of life is not always easy. As a disciple of Jesus, I don't act on my sexual feelings. That's not always easy. But ultimately, if we have Jesus himself, it starts to matter less to us whether we feel like we've got a kind of romantic fulfillment on the horizon in this life. It just matters less to me whether or not I get married. Because the most fully human and complete person who ever walked on this planet was Jesus. He never married. He was never romantically involved. He never had sex. Because those are not the things that are ultimately fundamental for us. What is ultimately fundamental is having Jesus himself, being in a relationship with the bridegroom. Jesus says if we have him, ultimately, we lack nothing. So I have found Jesus to be surprising. He is uniquely challenging, but he's uniquely challenging to every single one of us. He's uniquely dignifying at the very point at which our culture so often isn't. And he's uniquely satisfying. He claims that he alone can meet our very deepest needs, fulfill our greatest longings, and be the one relationship that will never, never let us down. Let me pray. Our Father, we want to thank you for Jesus Christ. We want to thank you that he came into this world and for what he taught us, that we can have light shed on these areas of life that can often feel so confusing and bewildering to us. But we thank you, Father, not just that Jesus came and that he taught us, but we thank you he came ultimately to die for us, to bear in himself all of our sin, to take on himself all of our mess, all of our brokenness, all of our shame, all of our guilt, that we might find in him forgiveness and wholeness and freedom and completion and ultimate satisfaction. That we might find in him the one who is the Savior of the world, who is the Son of the living God, and who is also the bridegroom. The one who is the ultimate answer to our greatest longings and yearnings. We thank you for him. And we praise you in his name. Amen.